You're listening to Apartheid Off Podcast, the Get to Know project. Listen and resist.
At so many points across this past year of campaigning with Apartheid Off Campus against our university's complicity in Israel's apartheid, have we evoked the South African anti-apartheid movement, and this episode we have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Heffernan, a professor of history at the University of Durham, who has joined us for a conversation on the anti-apartheid youth movement of South Africa, and specifically on the South African Students' Organisation, also known as SASO. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. And to start things off, Anne, can you give us an introduction into the history that gave birth to SASO, who they were and what they set out to do?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for inviting me to take part in the podcast. It's a pleasure to be here. So SASO emerges on South African university campuses in 1968, 1969. But it's probably helpful to go a little bit further back because I am a historian, to give your listeners a little bit of historical context of what those campuses look like and how that prompts the emergence of this new student organization.
Sure, yeah.
So obviously the term apartheid is very familiar to your listeners.
Yeah.
It originated in South Africa in the late 1940s as a political and social project to legally enforce segregation in all aspects of South African society. And basically that took the shape of building a structure of laws that infiltrated every aspect of people's lives. And so for my work, which tends to focus on student politics, I'm particularly interested in how that has ramifications for young people's lives and the institutions that they spend time in. So apartheid comes to university campuses a little bit later than it comes to schools. Schools are segregated during the colonial period, I should say, but that gets really kind of entrenched and homogenized at a national level in the early 1950s. In the late 1950s, the government gets around to segregating universities. And so South Africa had a number of universities at the time. One of them, the University of Fort Hare, was a historically Black university. Fort Hare was founded in 1916. All of the others were what we would think of as historically white universities, but several of them accepted students of color, tending to be kind of in the minority, but still you could study at a place like the University of the Witwatersrand or the University of Cape Town if you were a Black student or an Indian student.
Sure.
After 1959, that's no longer the case. The government sets up universities that are specifically segregated for each racial group. And they go actually even a step further. They segregate by ethnicity. Basically, by the 1960s, if you want to go to university in South Africa, your choice of university is not determined by where you live, what you want to study, where your parents studied. It's determined by your race and your ethnic group. And so what this does is it leads to the creation of a new sort of set of universities that the government establishes for Black and brown students. And we've got now historically white universities and historically Black universities in the kind of terrain of higher education. In terms of student politics, there's one organization that's kind of trying to straddle those spaces called the National Union of South African Students, or NUSAS. And it's a very leftist kind of radical organization. It espouses non-racialism, by which it means anybody of any racial group in South Africa can be a member of NUSAS, can take part in the politics that it's trying to foment on campuses. And so that is very much true in NUSAS's ethos, but the kind of locus of power for NUSAS is very much in those historically white institutions. They're older, they're much more well-resourced, they're the spaces that NUSAS was born in, because most of the historically Black universities didn't exist before 1959. And so over the course of the 1960s, you get a generation of university students coming up in these new kind of segregated university spaces and thinking about the politics that they're confronting in their world, which is deeply, deeply oppressive and becoming kind of ever more so. And they're not finding NUSAS in particular and the kind of broader environment of student politics that exists for them on university campuses is an adequate way for them to address their concerns, right? So that's kind of the state of play by the late 1960s. And at that point in time, several people who are members of NUSAS several Black members of NUSAS decide to break with that organization. And they say, we need our own political organizing space. So most famously, they're led by Steve Biko, but there are a range of other sort of prominent SASO activists and thinkers. We can talk a little bit more about some of them. But in 1968, they get this idea, and by 1969, they're ready, and they launch the South African Students Organization as the new space for Black student political organization on university campuses throughout South Africa.
Yeah, no, I mean, immediately listening, there's, obviously the fact that we are recording on Apartheid Off podcast, which is obviously linked to Apartheid Off Campus. There's just like immediate kind of correlations that I'm thinking about in terms of the way in which, you're speaking about the creation of SASO and the need to have a space which is, actually owned by the people who are attempting to, implement change. And maybe before we come on to some of the key figures in SASO, or some of the key events that happened and how that impacted the organization, I wanted to ask, what was the significance of SASO being a youth movement, and how that played out?
It's a really good question. I think there are a lot of sort of points of significance of SASO being something that emerges from youth and student spaces. And these have a lot to do with kind of when it emerges as well. The 1960s tends to be described as a period of like political quiescence in the anti-apartheid struggle. So the 1950s are like big mass marches in the streets. It's the sort of heyday of the ANC's first wave of anti-apartheid activism. You get mass arrests, treason trials. It's a very kind of very publicly active time. The 1960s, you have really sort of harsh government repression coming in very early in the decade, beginning with two things. The banning of the African National Congress and the Pan-African Congress, so two liberation organizations, and then the Sharpeville massacre, in which 69 people are killed in a paths burning protest outside a police station and outside a town called Sharpeville. So the 1960s, you don't have that kind of overt activism in the same way you did. I'll put like an asterisk on that and say that most historians will qualify that and point you, and I will, to different pockets of activism.
Yeah.
So, and actually, like the conventional narrative of this in history books is that the 1960s are quiescent, and it's not until really the mid 1970s that you get sort of overt activism.
Yeah.
And I'm going to tell you that that's wrong, because at the end of the 1960s, you have this new generation of youth activists, of young university students who say, our parents' generation has been kind of cowed by this harsh repression. We need to do more. And not just we need to do more, we need to take political activism in different directions. So it's significant that SASO does not emerge as something that's aligned with either the ANC, the African National Congress, or the PAC, the Pan-African Congress. It has sort of points of agreement and disagreement with both of them ideologically, but it's doing its own new thing. And I don't think you get that kind of a politics except for the fact that it's emerging in a university space. And it's really people playing with new philosophical ideas of what it is to be Black in South Africa, and what it is to be Black more globally as well.
I mean, it definitely like relates to personal experience, being an activist on campus. And, you know, also, if I could back that up with a little bit of reading, you know, some of the work of Aziz Chowdhury and the university and social justice, and how like unique a place in some senses the university can be for kind of being a catalyst for radical change, or even just a will for radical change. And maybe now would be a great time to go back to some of the leaders and like some of the people who were, you know, at the forefront of this particular Black student organization in South Africa. And it's time for me to ask, like, you know, what impact SASO had, and I guess who was responsible for the work they carried out.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm going to answer that, but just to pick up one thing on your point about universities as being these sorts of spaces of foment and ideas, I think that's hugely important. And also, there's this kind of deep and wonderful irony that the apartheid state went to such a great degree of trouble and expense to set up these Black universities in really remote places. They tried to make them isolated. They tried to ensure that they were just basically going to supply school teachers, nurses, civil servants to their Bantustans, their kind of segregated Black political spaces. But what they become are really hothouses for national student politics, anti-apartheid politics, in really incredibly powerful ways. Which brings me to kind of who's involved in that process. How does that happen? I mentioned Steve Biko, and it's worth saying a little bit about Biko because he becomes really considered the founding father of SASO and the Black consciousness movement, which emerges out of SASO. Yep. So the South African Students Organization is founded in 1969, specifically within university spaces. By the early 1970s, it's really expanded. There are a lot of sister and brother organizations that are targeting different sort of parts of the population, working adults, school students, and you'll get media organizations that are kind of think of themselves as Black consciousness affiliates. And we think of all of these kind of organizations as part of the Black consciousness movement. So Biko is one of several university students who basically comes up with this idea that there needs to be a Black student organization. He probably is at the time, certainly becomes the most prominent. And that process is really solidified after his death in 1977 in police custody. He's killed. So he becomes very much a martyr to the cause. Yeah. But in those 8 years between the founding of SASO and him being killed, he and a number of other leaders basically build this organization from nothing, initially on their own university campuses. So Biko's a student at the University of Durban, Westville Black campus. So he's a medical student, which means he's kind of attached to a historically white university, but within that space, they've created a Black segregated space for those students. And because apartheid was just so incredibly pervasive, it could not allow any sort of form of mixing. So Biko, Barney Pichana, who is a seminarian. So you get this kind of range of interesting disciplinary background of thinkers in SASO. Mampela Rampele, who is for a while Biko's partner, but also an incredibly erudite and powerful woman in her own right. And she also becomes the medical doctor slightly later. So all of those people, I should say, are located on the coast. So between Durban and parts of the Eastern Cape and southern South Africa. And then my work is on one of those historically Black campuses in the far north of South Africa, called the University of the North. And the most significant SASO activist to come out of that university is a man called Ngopotse Tiro. So you get kind of student activists from a range of different backgrounds around the country. Importantly, different class backgrounds. Tiro is much more working class than the other three people I've just mentioned. He has a background sort of working on mines before he's able to get to university. And they come to this project really as I mentioned, they're not adopting the politics of previous liberation organizations. They're trying to think through new ways of doing activism and also what that activism is for. So they come up with the idea of Black consciousness, trying to pursue Black consciousness, which is a kind of psychological project as much as it is a political one.
I'm kind of in this position where I'm like taking in this, what you're saying, the history of SASO and these individuals, and there's just like giving birth to so many questions and how I relate to it as a student activist myself, but also how it relates specifically to anti-apartheid, Palestinian related work, anti-Israeli apartheid. Palestinian activism. And I think one question that I do want to ask as well is just on the significance of the Soweto Uprising.
45 years ago today.
That's, oh wow, wicked.
The anniversary.
Didn't even realize. But yeah, so 45 years on, and I wanted to ask, just being aware that it's such a pivotal point in South African history, I wanted to get your insight on how that related to the SASO movement and how that related to youth politics in South Africa at the time.
Absolutely. So the Soweto Uprising happened began on June 16th, 1976, wow. So 45 years ago today, which is well timed. And I mentioned earlier that the kind of conventional narrative of South African history is that there's this period of quiescence from the beginning of the 1960s until the middle of the 1970s. And in that conventional narrative, it's the Soweto Uprising that breaks the quiescence. And what happened on that day is that tens of thousands of school students, secondary school students, marched through the streets of Soweto ostensibly in protest at the imposition of Afrikaans, the sort of language of the apartheid state, as a teaching medium. So all students already took Afrikaans as like a class, but now the law was saying that they were going to have to learn other subjects in it. So you were like going to have to do biology in Afrikaans or maths in Afrikaans.
Yeah.
And this prompts really widespread student protests because many students didn't have the sort of facility with the language. Many teachers didn't have the facility with the language to feel that they were equipped to teach in it. Yeah. But it was also very much seen as the kind of language of the oppressor. It was the language of state, the language of the apartheid state. And so students decide to march against this. They're met with brutal police repression, and police dogs are released into the crowds. The students, and again, these are kids. These are 12, 13, 14, 15-year-olds, are fired on, killed. And so it's this hugely kind of pivotal moment in anti-apartheid protest because it does a number of things. The first thing that it does, which is really important, is that it brings to basically all older generations in South Africa, it brings young people into the political conversation in a way that nobody has really taken them seriously. Before this, people don't think of school students as being political actors really very much. Certainly the formal liberation organizations did not, although they capitalize on this moment afterwards. But I would argue that SASO is incredibly important in this story because one kind of group of people who did think that students had a real political role to play were these slightly older university students. So I mentioned that SASO kind of is the epicenter of the Black consciousness movement, and that it sets up all sorts of other outreach sort of organizations to different constituencies. Some of that work is done in schools, and there's very kind of active efforts to conscientize school students. So a lot of SASO activists, when they either graduate from university or far more frequently when they get expelled from university because of their political activism, wind up getting jobs in schools in townships, many of them in Soweto and in other parts of the country. And so from 1972 to 1976, we can trace a whole kind of genealogy of these, I call them teacher activists, who are in schools and talking to these kids about politics in really sort of tangible ways, relating their everyday experience to these broader structures. And we do interviews, we do oral history with some of the activists who were involved in the Soweto Uprising, and they give credit to a lot of different political influences. It's important to say that this is not a unidirectional kind of flow of ideas, but certainly many of them do recognize the importance of these SASO activists, these Black consciousness thinkers, in their own kind of political awakening and decision to take part in an event like the Soweto Uprising.
I'm gonna take the conversation elsewhere, but it's just so interesting to hear on the relationship that young people have within events that are, in South African history at least, thought on as such pivotal moments. And it resists back the notion, as I'm understanding, that, you know, students are kind of at the periphery of social change. And so on a personal basis as well, it's also just incredibly inspiring to hear such stories. But as I said, and as we'll have to wrap up the conversation shortly, I guess for me, one of the questions I really did want to ask is, you know, living and kind of being in a movement, and I'm speaking, you know, specifically to the AOC, the Apartheid Off Campus movement here, you know, being based in a capital of empire, the context may shift from being in that kind of raw experience of apartheid that Black students had in South Africa, but certainly as a group whose efforts are geared towards dismantling an apartheid system, the apartheid system that Palestinians suffer from. There are undoubtedly connections that we can draw between SASO and the student movements, particularly in occupied Palestine. And I guess moving forward and you know, with this history, you know, my question, which is quite a basic one, is what can we learn from SASO? And I know that in some ways is the start of a book, but in other ways, if you could kind of speak perhaps to the transnational nature of student activism today, and definitely the kind of influence that SASO and similar movements are able to have and have been able to, you know, kind of impact the world with.
Yeah, I don't think it's a simple question at all. I think it's a complicated and important question to grapple with. I think, gosh, what can student activists today learn from SASO? I think there are a number of ways you could kind of take that. One is engaging with rethinking aspects of its ideology and its philosophies. And so at the beginning, before we began recording, you mentioned you'd been reading Steve Biko. SASO activists wrote a lot, and Biko in particular published. So we have access to a lot of their thinking really readily. And it's in terms of contemporary South African student movement, it's been really interesting, particularly in relation to Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall, which happened in the last sort of 5-6 years. They embraced but reinterpreted Black consciousness thinking, rereading those writers from the 1970s, but thinking about them in ways that were much more relevant to 21st century South Africa, to life in post-apartheid South Africa. They brought really intersectional lenses to it, bringing queer theory into conversation. These are things that SASO is not really doing in the 1970s, but there's so much kind of space for, I think, fertile rethinking of those ideas. And this is why being an activist in a university space is wonderful and rich, because people are doing that kind of thinking. So I think there's that degree that SASO sort of has left a legacy of sort of political philosophy that other activists can and do draw on. There are also real sort of strategic and structural lessons that I think are worth thinking about how SASO organized itself, creating cross-campus solidarities really, really effectively. So that, like, in the university that I work on, for the most part, the University of the North, this one particular activist, Ongaputse Tiro, gets expelled in 1972. And SASO is able to mobilize around that nationwide. So there are walkouts and class boycotts on all of the different historically Black campuses. So those sorts of solidarities across institutions are really a powerful mechanism for activism. A hard thing to build, right? A challenging thing. And one that I think one of the things they did that I thought was so clever was kind of, networking sounds like a terrible sort of neoliberal term, but basically they would, so maybe let's not call it that, but a couple of times a year, they would set up like events. They called them intervarsity days because they call university varsity, where you would have like these sort of big get-togethers of SASO activists from all across the country doing sports days, watching their own cultural productions, having poetry readings, showing plays that they'd written, and just really building those sort of socio-political relationships. I think that's part of how they were able to really make those networks very strong.
Unfortunately, we do need to wrap things up there, but this has been such an insightful conversation and one that has left me with many more questions. But honestly, Anne, thank you so much for sharing your work, your research, and the history you shared with us today has been so inspiring to listen to. So a massive thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.